The janitor's daughter was laughed at by three CEOs in front of the entire boardroom. What her father said next didn't just silence the room, it made the most powerful people in the city bow their heads in shame. Before we dive in, take a moment to drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? And don't forget to hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's story will blow your mind. Jack Renner moved through the building like part of its skeleton. Quiet, steady, unseen, and essential. 42 years old, shoulders thick from years of carrying weight no one else wanted to lift, he pushed his janitor's cart across the polished marble floors of Harrington Tower, a skyscraper where the city's most powerful men and women brokered deals worth more than he'd make in 10 lifetimes. His uniform was navy blue, patched at the elbow, name tag scuffed from years of wear. People looked right through it, right through him, like the fabric itself rendered him invisible. And maybe it did. He'd grown used to being furniture in motion, something you only noticed if it squeaked. But Sarah noticed, always. His 10-year-old daughter often perched on one of the lobby chairs after school, homework spread out like a fragile fortress of notebooks and pencils. She would wait while he worked, sketching buildings or doodling flowers in the margins of her math worksheets. To her, her father wasn't invisible. He was everything, provider, protector, the man who remembered to pack her lunch with the apple slices cut thin because she hated chewing the skins. She had inherited her mother's patience, her way of sitting quietly and seeing the small details others ignored. When Jack passed by, pushing his mop bucket or bending down to gather trash, she looked up every time. Always, as if making sure the world didn't forget him. Jack never complained about the labor. Floors needed cleaning, trash needed emptying, and he was good at it. What unsettled him wasn't the work, but the way people's eyes slid past him. Executives in tailored suits, eyes glued to their phones, breezed past like he was part of the decor. No nod, no acknowledgement, just silence, and the occasional barked request if a light flickered or a spill threatened their expensive shoes. He wasn't bitter, not really. But sometimes in the quiet of the elevator shaft or the echoing hallways after midnight, he wondered if invisibility was eroding more than just his pride. This building carried ghosts for him. Emma, his late wife, had once walked through the same revolving glass doors with blueprints tucked under her arm, wide-eyed with dreams of becoming the architect who would shape skylines. She had whispered to him that she wanted her work to stand tall enough to touch clouds. But life had other plans. Illness had taken her before her hands could leave their mark on the city. Jack never stopped seeing her fingerprints on the glass walls, her reflection in the boardroom windows. Every corner of Harrington Tower reminded him of what she'd wanted and what she never got the chance to build. Cleaning it night after night was like polishing someone else's dream while burying his own. He moved methodically, cloth in hand, buffing smudges from the chrome handles of the boardroom doors. Inside, laughter spilled faintly through the glass. He could hear the voices of CEOs, sharp and commanding, talking about mergers and markets, lives reduced to numbers and percentages. He paused, wiping slowly, listening not to their words but to the way they filled space with certainty. He thought about how Sarah had once asked him, "Dad, why don't people see you?" He hadn't known how to answer. Maybe because they didn't want to. Maybe because if they acknowledged him, they'd have to admit the floor they stood on stayed clean because of his hands. He glanced toward the lobby where Sarah sat, legs curled beneath her, tongue peeking from the corner of her mouth as she shaded a sketch of the building in her notebook. She was drawing the tower itself, but in her lines it wasn't steel and glass. It was alive, with roots stretching into the ground and branches reaching toward the sky. She looked up, caught his eye, and smiled. For her, he wasn't invisible. He was the foundation. Jack returned the smile, a faint curve of lips that faded as quickly as it came. He turned back to his work, pressing the cloth against the boardroom door until the brass gleamed. He didn't know it yet, but the same executives who ignored him would soon find themselves forced to look at him, not as the man who polished their reflection, but as the man who shattered it. Tonight, the silence he carried so carefully was about to crack, and when it did, it wouldn't just echo through marble hallways. It would change the way his daughter looked at the world, and the way the world looked at him. Would you like me to continue writing the next chapter in the same 500 to 700 word cinematic style, or would you prefer I complete the full story chapter by chapter outline, first before expanding? Sarah's pencil rarely stopped moving. While other kids her age scrolled endlessly through tablets or sat glued to TV screens, she lived inside the quiet scratch of graphite on paper. It was how she told her stories, how she understood the world. Every evening, while Jack wheeled his cart across the glossy floors of Harrington Tower, she curled up in one of the lobby chairs with her sketchbook balanced on her knees. She would glance up often, eyes darting across the glass, the marble, the constant flow of shoes clicking past her. Then she would bend back down, capturing what she saw in lines and shapes only she could translate. She drew the tower from every angle, the way the windows gleamed in the morning, the curve of the revolving doors, the endless stretch of the lobby ceiling that made everyone look smaller than they wanted to. She even drew Jack's mop cart, cluttered with spray bottles and folded cloths, but in her version it wasn't ordinary. She gave it wheels like a chariot, a flag at the top, even a tiny shield drawn on its side. Secretly heroic, she'd whispered once when Jack asked why she bothered with something so plain. Because it carries more than anyone notices. Jack had smiled faintly, though his chest ached at the truth buried in her words. One evening, while the city pulsed outside in streaks of red taillights, Sarah was bent over her sketchbook again. Jack was nearby, polishing the chrome fixtures outside the boardroom doors. He noticed how still she'd grown, how her tongue poked slightly from the corner of her mouth when she was concentrating. He paused mid-swipe, cloth frozen in his hand, and watched her pencil dance across the page. Her strokes were sharper this time, less whimsical, more deliberate. She wasn't drawing the building or his cart. She was drawing people. Jack wiped his hands on his uniform and walked over quietly. Sarah didn't look up as he crouched beside her. On the page was a long table, its surface dark and smooth, lined with tall-backed chairs. Behind the glass wall she had sketched 3 towering figures in suits, their shoulders exaggerated, their heads tilted down like judges. At the other end of the table was a tiny figure, barely more than an outline of a girl, curled inward beneath their looming presence. The proportions were wrong, and yet they weren't. The drawing said more than any photograph could. Jack cleared his throat softly. "What's this one, sweetheart?" Sarah blinked and finally looked up at him, her eyes wide and unguarded. "That's the boardroom," she said simply. Then she tapped the small figure with her pencil. "That's me." The words hit Jack harder than he expected. He swallowed, the back of his throat dry. "Why you?" he asked carefully. She hesitated, chewing the inside of her cheek the way she always did when she wasn't sure if she should answer. Then, in the quietest voice, she said, "Because that's what it feels like when they look at me. Like I'm too small, like I shouldn't be here." Jack's chest tightened until it was hard to breathe. He had spent years carrying the weight of invisibility, convincing himself it didn't matter, that it was easier if no one noticed him. But Sarah was noticing. She was only 10, and already she saw the invisible lines that carved the world into winners and people like them. Lines that made laughter echo louder when it wasn't meant for you. Lines that made a child feel like she didn't belong in the building where her father spent his life unseen. He reached out and gently closed the sketchbook, his rough hand covering hers. "Hey," he said softly, "you're not small." Sarah frowned, eyes glistening. "But they make me feel small." Jack wanted to tell her she was wrong, that the suits didn't matter, that money and power couldn't measure worth. But lying to her had never been his way. So instead, he pulled her close, pressed his chin lightly against the crown of her hair, and whispered, "Then maybe it's time they see what you see." Sarah didn't understand what he meant, not yet. She tucked her sketchbook back into her backpack, thinking it would stay there like all the others. But Jack knew. He saw in those rough pencil strokes something dangerous, something necessary, a mirror no executive could look at without seeing themselves stripped bare. He stood and returned to his cart, his steps slower, heavier. Sarah had just drawn the truth he had been swallowing for years. And though she didn't realize it, her sketch was the beginning of a storm that would one day shake the boardroom walls to their foundations. The day had begun without promise, like any other Monday. Jack pushed his cart across the vast expanse of Harrington Tower's marble lobby, his movement steady, unremarkable, invisible to the flood of sharp shoes and tailored suits. His cloth glided in wide arcs across the gleaming floor, each stroke a ritual he could do blindfolded. Sarah sat in her usual chair off to the side, her sketchbook balanced on her lap, a juice box tucked into the crook of her arm. She was quiet, drawing with that fierce concentration of hers, while the world around her buzzed with transactions and tension she didn't yet fully understand. Then it happened. A simple accident. She shifted too quickly, her elbow catching the corner of the box, and a stream of bright orange spilled across the pristine marble. The liquid spread quickly, staining the white surface with streaks that looked like fire against snow. Sarah gasped, eyes wide, and leapt to her feet, napkins spilling from her backpack. She dropped to her knees, pressing them against the floor, frantic to erase her mistake before anyone noticed. But people noticed. 3 men strode through the revolving doors at that exact moment, voices carrying like thunder through the glass and steel. They were the kind of men whose laughter always seemed to demand an audience, loud, assured, practiced in the art of filling silence with importance. CEOs, each of them, here for a high-stakes merger that would determine which company swallowed the other whole. To them, the spilled juice was not an accident, but an opportunity. They slowed, exchanged glances, then smirked. One leaned slightly toward the others and said it, low but sharp enough to cut across the lobby, like father, like daughter, destined to mop floors. The words hung in the air, cruel in their simplicity. A joke to them, a wound to her. Sarah froze, her hands still pressed to the floor, napkins soaked and useless. Her cheeks flushed crimson, and her breathing quickened. She didn't look up, couldn't. She just kept scrubbing harder, though the mess only smeared wider. Her small shoulders shook with the effort to make herself invisible. Jack heard it all. He had been crouched a few feet away, polishing the chrome base of a pillar. The cloth stopped mid-swipe. His back stiffened. Years of swallowing remarks, of letting mockery slide off his uniform like water off wax, pressed against his ribs. He'd lived long enough to know silence could be a kind of survival, a protest sharper than words. But as he looked at Sarah, knees on marble, napkins trembling in her hands, he realized this wasn't about him anymore. This was about her. He stood slowly, every muscle in his body deliberate, measured. His boots echoed against the floor, louder than the men's laughter. He didn't speak, not yet. He wanted them to feel the weight of the silence first, the kind that made people shift in their shoes, the kind that stripped the humor from cruelty. Sarah glanced up at him then, her eyes glassy with embarrassment, her face pleading for reassurance he couldn't give with a nod or a smile. Not this time. The 3 executives lingered, amused with themselves, their smugness a shield they'd worn so long they mistook it for skin. They waited for him to shrink, to bow his head, to hurry forward and clean up the mess as proof of their words. But Jack didn't bend. His hands rested at his sides, fists just shy of clenching, his jaw set. The air between them was thick with something unspoken, dangerous, alive. He had endured the invisibility, the dismissive jokes, the sneers tossed his way when they thought he couldn't hear. But watching Sarah absorb it, watching her innocence buckle under the same weight he'd carried for decades, ignited something he couldn't suppress. Silence had been his shield. Tonight, it would become his weapon. And for the first time, the marble lobby of Harrington Tower felt less like a workplace and more like a battlefield. The juice still spread across the floor, napkins scattered, Sarah still trembling. But the men's laughter faltered, caught in the space where Jack Renner finally drew a line. He didn't speak yet, but when he did, the words would echo far beyond polished floors and boardroom walls. Sarah's lip quivered as she pressed the napkin harder against the marble, desperate to blot out the orange stain spreading beneath her hands. Her knees scuffed against the polished floor, and the laughter of the men ricocheted off the walls like shards of broken glass. Each chuckle seemed to cut deeper, slicing into the fragile shell of her courage. She didn't dare look up. Children know when they are being mocked. They feel it in their bones even before they understand the words. Her breath caught, shallow and shaky. Jack stood motionless for a moment, watching her. The mop leaned in its bucket beside him, handle tilted like a flag of surrender. He had never been a man of confrontation. Years of war had taught him the danger of words spoken too quickly, and years of janitorial silence had taught him the safety of blending into the background. But now, watching his daughter crumble under laughter meant for him his restraint cracked. He wasn't a janitor in that moment. He wasn't even a man trying to keep his head down. He was simply a father, and fathers don't stay silent when their children are wounded. He crossed the lobby slowly, each step heavy with decision. Kneeling beside Sarah, he eased the napkin from her trembling fingers. His voice dropped low, soft enough for only her to hear. "You don't apologize for existing," he whispered. His hand lingered against hers just long enough to steady the tremor in her grip. She blinked at him, eyes wide, a fragile spark of reassurance flickering there. Then he stood. The stillness that followed was heavier than any noise. Jack's frame unfolded tall and steady, his shadow stretching across the spill. His chest rose with a measured breath, and when he spoke, his voice carried farther than he thought it could. "Apologize to her." The three men stopped mid-stride. Their shoes clicked against the marble as they turned, confusion sliding into amusement. Apologize to a janitor's daughter. Their smirks spread, easy and practiced, but they didn't see the current running beneath Jack's calm. The crowd that had begun to gather near the reception desk went still, sensing something had shifted in the air. Mercer Crane, the tallest of the three, tilted his head with mock interest. "Excuse me?" Jack didn't flinch. "You heard me." His tone wasn't sharp, it wasn't raised, but it held a weight that made the receptionist lower her eyes and the security guard shift uncomfortably in place. The executives glanced at one another, smirks curling tighter. "We don't apologize for jokes," one said lightly, his hand brushing invisible lint from his cuff. Jack's jaw worked, the muscle twitching just once. His voice came again, this time slower, each word like a stone placed deliberately on the ground between them. "That wasn't a joke. That was a wound, and you don't walk away from a wound without acknowledging it." For a heartbeat, the entire lobby felt suspended. The air, the lights, even the hum of the elevators seemed to pause. Sarah rose, halfway from her knees, napkin crushed in her small hand, staring at her father as if she were seeing him for the first time. The man who pushed carts and bent to other people's messes was now standing taller than the ceilings above them. The CEOs shifted. Their amusement faltered. Reckoning wasn't a word they were used to hearing in this building, not from investors, not from rivals, and certainly not from the man who scrubbed their floors. Yet here it was, standing in front of them with quiet authority, daring them to confront the humanity they had laughed at seconds before. "Apologize to her," Jack repeated, softer now, but sharper for it. It wasn't a plea, it wasn't anger. It was the kind of command that came from a place deeper than titles or money or power, the kind that could only come from a father defending the dignity of his child. And in the silence that followed, even marble seemed to listen. Mercer Crane turned slowly, his silver cufflinks catching the lobby's light as if they too wanted to sneer. His mouth curled into a smirk honed by decades of winning rooms without ever conceding an inch. "Apologize," he repeated, savoring the word like it was absurd. His voice dripped with disdain. "To a child? Over a joke?" The other two men with him chuckled, the sound low and complicit. They weren't laughing at the humor. They were laughing at the idea of a janitor daring to demand anything from them. Their amusement was a shield, their smirks armor. They had spent years in boardrooms where their every word drew nods, their every whim catered to. They were not accustomed to being questioned, least of all by a man who carried a mop instead of a briefcase. Jack didn't move at first. His silence deepened, stretching into something that pressed against their composure. Then he stepped forward, his boots echoing against the marble. Each step seemed to swallow their laughter. He stopped close enough that Mercer had to look at him fully, not as a passing inconvenience, but as a man who refused to shrink. "You think power is how loud you speak in a room," Jack said, voice steady, low enough to force them to lean into the weight of it. "But real power is knowing when your silence makes someone smaller, and refusing to let it happen." The smirk on Mercer's lips wavered, almost imperceptibly, but enough that the air shifted. His arrogance had been unshaken for so long that even the hint of a crack was startling. He opened his mouth to retort, but the words caught. Beside him, the second CEO shifted his weight. His polished shoes squeaked softly against the marble, a small sound that carried like thunder in the hush. His gaze flicked from Mercer to Jack, then downward toward Sarah, who stood clutching her sketchbook to her chest. Her fingers pressed white against the cardboard cover as if it were armor, her eyes wide, reflecting both fear and something new. Hope, maybe, or awe. She had seen her father scrub floors, take insults with bowed shoulders, walk invisible through crowds. She had never seen him like this, tall, unyielding, unafraid. For Sarah, the lobby transformed in that instant. It was no longer just marble and glass, but a stage where her father's voice cut sharper than the suit's laughter ever could. Mercer glanced at the crowd forming along the edges of the lobby, assistants pretending to shuffle papers, interns frozen mid-step, the receptionist with her hands trembling just slightly on the keyboard. All of them were listening. All of them were watching. His smirk tightened, hardening into something colder. He hated witnesses. He hated moments that slipped beyond his control. Jack, however, stood unbothered by the eyes. His attention never left Mercer. "You laughed at her," he said quietly, "and you thought it was small enough to forget. But she will remember. Children always do. And one day she'll learn from it. So I'm asking you again, what do you want her to learn from you tonight?" The question wasn't rhetorical, and Mercer knew it. That was the problem. His tongue, so often quick with cutting words, hesitated. Sarah's breath caught. She didn't understand all of it, not yet, but she understood enough. Her father wasn't just standing up for her. He was giving her a lesson, what dignity sounded like when spoken out loud. The second CEO coughed softly, a nervous tick, his gaze lowering as though ashamed. The third shifted his stance but said nothing. Mercer's smirk faltered completely now, the lines of his face twitching as if something inside him was fighting to maintain control. He opened his mouth again, then closed it. Jack waited, still as stone, his silence louder than Mercer's authority had ever been. The crowd leaned into it. Sarah clutched her sketchbook tighter, her heart pounding, her eyes locked on the man who had just redefined what strength meant. In that moment, Mercer Crane realized the balance had shifted. For the first time in his gilded career, a janitor's words had made him feel small, and the sting of that truth burned hotter than any boardroom defeat. Jack's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. What carried through the lobby wasn't anger, but the weight of memory, old and unhealed. His words had been forged years earlier in moments no one else had witnessed, moments that still pressed against his ribs when he walked these halls at night. He wasn't only speaking to 3 CEOs in polished suits, he was speaking to ghosts that lingered in every corner of Harrington Tower. He remembered the night Emma had stood at the very same glass doors, her portfolio clutched tightly to her chest. She had worn her best blazer, the one they'd saved up for, and shoes that pinched her feet because she thought looking sharp mattered more than comfort. She had walked into this building full of hope, designs tucked beneath her arm, sketches of light-filled atriums, green terraces carved into rooftops, and lines that curved toward the sky like open hands. Jack had watched her go in with shoulders squared, trembling but determined. He had waited outside on the curb, nerves tying him in knots, because he knew how much this meant to her. When she returned an hour later, he knew before she spoke. Her steps were smaller, her eyes unfocused, her hands clutching the portfolio not as a weapon, but as a shield. He had reached for her, and she had fallen into him, trembling against his chest. "They didn't even look at my work," she whispered. "They said I didn't look like someone who built towers." Those words had cut deeper than any rejection letter, deeper than any criticism. They weren't dismissing her drawings, they were dismissing her existence. Jack had held her that night as she cried into the fabric of his shirt, her voice muffled but steady in its grief. "They don't see me." Now, standing in the same lobby years later, he looked at Sarah on her knees with napkins trembling in her small hands, and it was as if time had folded in on itself. His wife's wound had returned in their daughter's eyes. The cruelty was the same, dressed in different words but carrying the same message. You don't belong here. Jack stepped forward, the memories burning behind his eyes. He looked at the three men, his gaze steady, his voice unshaken. "My wife dreamed of these walls," he said. His words rang against the marble, soft but unyielding. "She dreamed of building towers that touched the sky. She died believing she didn't belong here." He let the silence fall for a beat, heavy and raw, before adding, "And tonight, you tried to tell my daughter the same thing." The laughter that had filled the air minutes earlier vanished as if it had never existed. A stillness blanketed the lobby, thick and suffocating. The crowd of onlookers shifted uncomfortably, their faces suddenly solemn. Even the receptionists lowered their eyes, fingers stilled on keyboards. The sound of the fountain in the corner became unbearably loud, each drop of water echoing in the hush. The security guard, who only minutes ago had stood stiff and watchful, now looked down at his polished shoes. He had seen countless confrontations in this building, angry clients, entitled executives, impatient investors, but never had he seen someone strip power from the powerful with nothing more than truth. Mercer Crane, so sure of his authority, faltered. His smirk had already slipped, but now his jaw tightened with something closer to unease. The other two executives shifted uncomfortably in their tailored suits. They weren't men accustomed to being called to account, least of all by someone they considered beneath them. Yet the conviction in Jack's voice left them with no room to laugh, no room to shrug it off as sentiment. Sarah clutched her sketchbook tighter to her chest, her wide eyes fixed on her father. She didn't understand every word, but she understood enough that her mother's absence was stitched into his every syllable, that he was carrying Emma's memory like a shield over them both. And for the first time, Sarah felt that the invisible lines pressing against her shoulders were being pushed back. Jack stood tall, his silence following his words like a verdict. He hadn't shouted, hadn't threatened, hadn't raised a hand. He had simply spoken what was true, and in that truth was a force more disarming than any boardroom strategy. The marble lobby of Harrington Tower, once echoing with laughter, now held its breath. And in that charged stillness, even the men who thought themselves untouchable found themselves lowering their gaze. The silence in the lobby was brittle, like glass stretched too thin. For a long moment no one moved. Jack's words still lingered in the air, heavy as stone, but it was the kind of silence that begged to be broken. And it wasn't the executives or Jack who broke it. It was Sarah. She pushed herself slowly to her feet, her small hands trembling as she hugged her sketchbook tight to her chest. Her cheeks were flushed, her lips pressed together as though she was holding back tears, but her eyes, wide, steady, glistening, were fixed on the men who had laughed. When she finally spoke, her voice was fragile, uncertain at first, but clear enough to pierce the marble echo. "I drew you." The words caught the room off guard. A child's voice in a place built for power was like a bell in a cathedral, impossible to ignore. The three CEOs frowned, confused, maybe even a little amused, as though this was another joke at their expense. Sarah fumbled with the corner of her sketchbook, fingers clumsy with nerves. But then, with a small, determined breath, she opened it wide and held it out for them to see. On the page, in rough pencil strokes, the truth stared back at them. A long table stretched across the drawing, sharp and unwelcoming. Behind it, three massive figures loomed, shoulders squared, heads bent down, their size exaggerated until they filled most of the page. And in the corner, near the edge of the table, was a tiny figure, a girl drawn smaller than she was in real life, her head bowed, her arms wrapped tight around herself. "That's what you look like to me," Sarah said, her voice shaking but gathering strength with each word. "Like giants that forget people have hearts." A ripple moved through the crowd that had gathered near the reception desk. Some gasped softly, others whispered to each other, but the men at the center of it all went still. For the first time that evening, they didn't look untouchable. They looked human. One of them swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing against the crisp edge of his collar. Another shifted his stance, eyes darting down toward the sketch, as if afraid to look too long. It wasn't just a child's drawing. It was truth in its purest, most unfiltered form. It was what all of them feared but never faced, how they looked to the people below them, the ones they stepped past, the ones they forgot. There was no corporate jargon to twist it, no press release to soften the blow. There it was, in pencil lines and a little girl's voice, the reflection they'd worked their entire lives to avoid. Jack stepped beside her, resting a steady hand on her shoulder. His touch grounded her, but his eyes never left the men in front of him. "Children see what we pretend not to," he said softly, his voice carrying across the hushed lobby. "They don't measure by titles or balance sheets. They see what we are when we think no one's looking." Sarah leaned into him slightly, clutching her sketchbook as though it was armor. But in that moment, she wasn't just his daughter. She was their mirror, and no amount of money or power could make them unsee what she had just shown them. For a long time, no one spoke. The CEOs, men who had spent their lives commanding rooms, found themselves speechless before the smallest voice in it. The lobby, usually alive with footsteps and chatter, felt frozen in time, every witness holding their breath. Even the fountain's steady trickle seemed subdued, as though water itself didn't dare to break the spell. The girl they had mocked for being small had forced them to see just how small they truly were. And in her trembling voice, in her simple drawing, she had said what no man in that tower had ever dared, that power without compassion was nothing but a shadow stretched too tall. The sound of footsteps along the marble was different now, not the quick, determined click of executives striding toward a meeting, but a hesitant shuffle, the kind that came when people lingered on the edges of something they weren't supposed to witness. At first it was a handful, two receptionists pausing mid-keystroke, a courier leaning against the wall pretending to check his delivery slip, an intern frozen with a stack of files in her arms. Then it spread. Assistants drifted out from side hallways, analysts slowed as they crossed the lobby, and one by one, the invisible people of Harrington Tower gathered in quiet clusters around the edges of the vast room. Phones appeared, discreet at first, held low, then raised higher. The soft glow of screens lit up like a constellation against the polished stone. Whispers threaded through the silence. Did he really say that? To his daughter? Unbelievable. The lobby, normally a space of rehearsed efficiency, had become a theater, and Jack stood at its center, not by choice, but by necessity. The three CEOs shifted uneasily, their polished confidence cracking under the weight of uninvited eyes. They thrived in boardrooms, glass-walled arenas where they controlled the narrative, where silence was orchestrated and applause predictable. But here, in the raw openness of the lobby, Their words weren't curated press releases or carefully staged announcements. Here, truth was messy, public, and unspinnable. Mercer Crane's smirk had thinned, stretched taut, as though it might split under the strain. He adjusted his cufflink, a meaningless gesture, but his fingers twitched as he did it. The second CEO cleared his throat, the sound oddly loud in the hush, while the third glanced at the crowd, his jaw tightening at the sight of phones capturing every detail. They had built their power on being untouchable, on existing just far enough above everyone else that no one dared speak back. But tonight, a janitor had spoken, and now 100 eyes were watching to see what they would do about it. Jack felt the weight of those eyes too. But it didn't press him down. It steadied him. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The stillness in the lobby carried his words farther than volume ever could. He had always known that laughter echoed easily in places like this. What he hadn't realized until now was that truth echoed louder. He looked at Sarah, standing close beside him, with her sketchbook clutched tight to her chest. Her cheeks were still flushed, but her chin was lifted a little higher now. She had seen what he wanted her to see, that she wasn't alone, that silence wasn't the only answer. Jack placed his hand gently on her shoulder, not to shield her, but to anchor her in the moment. Then he turned back to the men who had mocked her. "You're used to rooms where no one can answer back," Jack said, his tone even, his voice calm. "But this isn't that room. This isn't your table or your board. This is the lobby where every person you step past keeps this place running. You forgot that." The words rolled across the space like low thunder. No shouting, no dramatics, just truth spoken plainly. A murmur rippled through the gathered crowd. The receptionist closest to the desk pressed her lips together as though holding back applause. An intern lowered her phone for a moment, simply staring, as if realizing she was watching something she'd remember for the rest of her career. The CEOs stood rigid, but they weren't the ones in control anymore. The floor beneath them, polished by Jack's hands, no longer belonged to them. It belonged to the truth they couldn't contain, to the witnesses who had seen too much to forget. Jack straightened his shoulders, his silence following like a shadow. He didn't need to say more. The damage had already been done, not by anger, not by force, but by a man who had spent his life being unseen, finally making himself impossible to look past. And in that moment, every person watching knew the balance of power had shifted. Not toward the men in suits, but toward the father who had refused to let his daughter believe she was small. For a long moment, the three CEOs stood as if carved from the same block of marble that stretched beneath their feet. Immovable, untouchable, immune. Their suits were perfect, their posture rehearsed, but the silence pressing against them was not. It had weight, and it was beginning to bend the air. Jack didn't move. Sarah clutched her sketchbook so tightly the edges bent against her fingers, her knuckles white. The crowd at the edges of the lobby waited, breaths caught, eyes wide. And then something small, almost imperceptible, shifted. Evelyn Roth, the lone woman among the three, adjusted her stance. It wasn't much, a soft pivot of her heel, a loosening of her shoulders, but it carried more honesty than any speech she'd ever given at a podium. Her gaze lingered not on Jack but on Sarah, whose wide eyes glistened in the light. Something about the girl, standing there small but unbroken, reached past Evelyn's carefully constructed armor. Memories she thought she had buried deep clawed their way back. She remembered the sting of bleach on her hands as a teenager, standing beside her mother in a diner kitchen after hours, scrubbing floors until her knees ached. She remembered the way customers laughed when her accent slipped into her English, how they spoke around her as though she were invisible, as though her labor gave them the right to forget her humanity. She had sworn when she finally rose above it that she would never feel small again, and in the process she had buried the girl she once was. But Sarah's drawing had unearthed her. The towering figures, the bowed head of the child. It was too familiar, too close. It was a mirror she hadn't asked for, but one she couldn't turn away from. Evelyn's chest rose with a quiet, unsteady breath. Her eyes softened, losing the sharp edge that usually disarmed boardrooms. She glanced sideways at her colleagues, both stiff with defiance, then back at Sarah. For a moment, her lips pressed into a thin line, as though she were fighting the words. Then, with a voice so low it almost drowned in the marble echoes, she whispered, "I'm sorry." It wasn't loud. It wasn't grand, but it cut deeper than any proclamation could have. The sound of it shifted the balance in the room, as though a crack had formed in the polished wall of power the three of them had built around themselves. The crowd felt it. Heads turned toward Evelyn, and a hush fell even heavier than before. Sarah blinked, startled. She hadn't expected anyone to say it, not really. She clutched the sketchbook tighter, as if to hold onto the proof that her voice, however small, had reached someone. Her lip trembled, but this time not from fear. Something else was blooming there, something like relief. Jack inclined his head, just once. Not in triumph, not even in gratitude. It was more like acknowledgement, an understanding that Evelyn had let something buried rise to the surface, and that it mattered. 2 more to go. The other 2 CEOs stiffened further, as though Evelyn's small crack in composure had betrayed them. Mercer Crane's jaw worked, grinding against the silence, his smirk curling back into place like a mask. He refused to sit down. The third man shifted his weight uneasily, tapping one polished shoe against the marble, as if to remind himself he still stood above the man with the mop. But they both knew the balance was slipping. Evelyn had let the truth show through, and once truth was visible, it was hard to bury again. The crowd had seen it. The assistants, the interns, the receptionists, they weren't just watching a janitor stand up to power anymore. They were watching power bend, however slightly, to the voice of a child. Evelyn Roth, who had once been a girl scrubbing floors in silence, had remembered what it felt like, and in that remembering, she had handed the room something more dangerous than Jack's steady words. She had handed them the first crack in the facade. And once the first crack appeared, the rest was only a matter of time. Mercer Crane's smirk hardened into something colder as Evelyn's quiet apology rippled through the lobby. His arms crossed over his chest, his body language carved sharp as a blade, as if he could slice the tension down with posture alone. He straightened his back, puffed his chest, and let his voice cut across the silence with a dismissive scoff. "This is sentimentality," he declared, his tone dripping with disdain. "Business is about strength." The words echoed through the marble lobby, bouncing off glass walls, heavy with arrogance. It was the kind of statement Mercer had lived his entire life by. He'd clawed his way through boardrooms and mergers, built empires on intimidation, and perfected the art of equating ruthlessness with power. And usually, when he said something like that, no one dared to answer back. But Jack wasn't no one. He stepped forward, slow and deliberate, until only a breath separated the janitor's uniform from Mercer's $1,000 suit. Their eyes locked. Jack's were steady, unflinching, the kind of gaze forged not in conference rooms but in trenches, on factory floors, in sleepless hospital nights, in the raw grind of survival. Mercer blinked once, unused to being seen that way, not as untouchable but as transparent. "No," Jack said simply, his voice low but carrying. "Business is about people. And if you crush the smallest voice to feel big, that's not strength. That's weakness dressed in a suit." The sentence hung in the air, quiet but devastating. A murmur spread through the gathered crowd, receptionists glancing at one another, interns shifting where they stood, assistants whispering behind raised hands, phones lifted higher, recording every syllable. The words weren't loud, but they had already cut deeper than Mercer's booming pronouncement. For the first time in years, someone had not only refused to play Mercer's game, but had rewritten the rules entirely. He opened his mouth to respond, but the retort died in his throat, as though he knew anything he said would sound like the very weakness Jack had just named. Mercer's jaw clenched, the muscle twitching as he scanned the faces around him. These weren't just subordinates anymore. They were witnesses. And witnesses carried stories out of rooms, stories that spread faster than contracts or press releases. His own board would hear of this. His rivals would hear of this. Worse, his daughter, tucked away in some private school across the country, might one day hear that her father was humbled in a lobby by a janitor. The thought made his stomach twist. Jack didn't flinch under the weight of Mercer's glare. He didn't raise his hands or his voice. He simply stood there, solid, anchored by something Mercer couldn't understand. Dignity unshaken by position. Power drawn not from wealth, but from truth. Sarah clutched her sketchbook to her chest and looked up at her father, her wide eyes reflecting the shift. For the first time, she wasn't watching him shrink into silence. She was watching him rise. Mercer blinked again, a fraction too long, a fraction too slow. It was all it took for the crowd to feel it, that subtle slip of control, the falter of a man who had built his kingdom on the illusion that he was untouchable. And in that pause, in that blink, everyone understood something Mercer couldn't admit aloud. The janitor had already won. Not because he had shouted louder, not because he had overpowered him, but because he had spoken the kind of truth that didn't need volume. It was the kind of truth that lingered, the kind that couldn't be forgotten, the kind that turned giants into men and silence into thunder. Sarah's small hand tugged at Jack's sleeve, her fingers curling into the fabric like she was holding on to him for dear life. Her voice came so soft it was almost lost in the marble echo of the lobby. "Dad," she whispered, eyes brimming, "I don't want them to be sorry because you said so. I want them to be sorry because they mean it." Jack's chest tightened until he could barely breathe. The tremor in her words cut deeper than the CEO's laughter ever could. Out of the mouths of children came truths that stripped away all excuses, all polished defenses. Her innocence was sharp enough to pierce walls that years of boardroom battles had fortified. He swallowed, steadying his voice not just for her, but for everyone watching. He turned back toward the three figures in suits, their postures rigid, their faces masks of pride and discomfort. "You heard her," he said, his tone even, but carrying a weight that pressed into the corners of the room. "Don't apologize because I asked. Apologize because you remember what it feels like to be small." The words dropped into the silence like stones in water, ripples spreading outward. The crowd gathered along the edges shifted, the quiet of their presence deepening, heavy with expectation. The fountain in the lobby gurgled faintly, the only sound that dared interrupt. Even the security guard shifted uneasily, his eyes low, as though reminded of something in his own childhood he had long buried. The three CEOs stood caught in the hush, men unaccustomed to being weighed by anything but balance sheets and quarterly reports. Mercer Crane's smirk had faded to something harder, a line carved deep across his face as if holding it in place might keep him from cracking. The second man, Thomas Vale, shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his eyes dropping for the briefest moment before darting back up, restless. Evelyn Roth, who had already whispered her apology moments before, stood very still, her gaze locked on Sarah, softened by something close to recognition. Jack didn't move closer, didn't need to. He stood anchored, his hand resting lightly on Sarah's shoulder, his presence steady against the storm of silence. For Sarah, this moment wasn't about winning an argument. It was about seeing if the powerful could remember what it was like to be powerless. She clutched her sketchbook tight against her chest, tears beginning to spill down her cheeks. Not loud sobs, not dramatic, just the quiet breaking of a child's heart that had been asked to carry too much. Her tears weren't weakness, they were truth. They said what words couldn't, that laughter had wounded, that dignity mattered, that she deserved to be seen. And everyone watching felt it. Receptionists pressed their lips together, Interns blinked hard. Even the courier leaned against the wall as though his legs had forgotten how to stand. The soundless weight of a child's tears had done what anger never could. It made the whole room remember. Mercer's eyes flickered, just for a second, as if caught by something he couldn't quite suppress. Thomas Vale exhaled, sharp and uneven, his fingers twitching at his side. Evelyn's throat bobbed with an unspoken word. The pause stretched, long and unrelenting. Longer than any silence in a courtroom, longer than any pause before a deal was signed. It was the kind of silence that stripped the men of their titles, their power, their armor, and forced them to face something raw, the memory of being small. Jack's gaze swept over them unblinking. "So," he said quietly, "what will it be?" Empty words, or the kind that mean something. The question didn't need an answer right away. The weight of it already filled the lobby, heavier than any stock report, heavier than any quarterly projection, and for the first time in years, the men who thought themselves untouchable found themselves trembling in the shadow of a little girl's tears. Thomas Vale had always been the quieter one of the trio, content to let Mercer Crane take center stage with his booming voice and sharpened arrogance. He preferred efficiency over spectacle, numbers over noise. But as he stood there in the thick silence of the lobby, with 100 unseen eyes watching from the edges, something inside him shifted. Jack's words had cut deep, but it was Sarah's tears that unraveled him. He tried to keep his jaw set, his posture firm, but memories he hadn't thought about in years came clawing back with a vengeance. He remembered being 12, standing on the cracked pavement outside Lincoln Middle School, his shoes too small, the soles peeling. They had been his father's once, patched over with scraps of rubber, handed down because money had to stretch thinner than pride. He could still hear the laughter of boys whose families could afford new sneakers every fall. Factory boy, they'd called him. Shoes made of scraps. He had walked home that day with his head down, burning with shame, vowing that one day no one would ever laugh at him again. And yet here he was, decades later, standing in a polished lobby, while a child clutched her sketchbook and trembled under the weight of laughter that sounded far too familiar. It wasn't his laughter this time, but the sound of it echoed against the memory until it was unbearable. Thomas exhaled, a heavy, uneven sigh that seemed to carry years of unspoken things. Mercer shot him a quick, sharp glance, warning in his eyes, but Thomas didn't look back. He took a single step forward, the echo of his polished shoe ringing louder than it should have. He looked at Sarah, really looked, and the steel in his shoulders loosened. Her face was blotchy from holding back tears, her sketchbook clutched so tight, the cardboard bent at the corners. She looked up at him, not with hatred, not with rage, but with the raw vulnerability of a child asking if the world was safe. And Thomas felt something inside him break. His head bowed slightly, the smallest gesture of humility, but it carried the weight of everything he had once needed and never received. His voice came low, quiet, stripped of its usual boardroom certainty. "I'm sorry." No embellishment, no performance, just 2 words, but they carried more truth than anything he had spoken in years. Genuine, quiet, real. Sarah blinked, startled at first, then nodded once, a tiny movement that spoke volumes. She held her sketchbook tighter against her chest, as though the apology had stitched some of the torn edges inside her back together. For the first time that evening, the smallest flicker of relief touched her features. Around them, the crowd felt the shift. The whispering hushed into stillness. Assistants exchanged glances, interns lowered their phones slightly, receptionists softened their expressions. They had just witnessed something rare, power-bending, pride-breaking, the kind of honesty that couldn't be written into contracts or smoothed over in press statements. Jack stood steady beside his daughter, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. He gave Thomas a single nod, not of victory but of acknowledgement, a recognition that the apology wasn't empty, that it mattered, 2 down. But when Jack's gaze turned toward the last one, Mercer Crane, still stiff, still stone-faced. The weight in the room thickened again. Mercer hadn't moved, hadn't softened, hadn't let the smallest crack form in his polished armor. His arms were crossed, his chin tilted high, his eyes glittering with defiance. If anything, Thomas's apology only made his pride dig in deeper. And yet, beneath the marble silence, beneath the stares of the crowd, even Mercer could feel it. The ground was shifting. The balance was no longer his to command. Two voices had already bent toward truth. His was the only one left standing in the wreckage of arrogance. The lobby held its breath, waiting. Mercer Crane stood rigid, arms folded across his chest like armor that had never once failed him. For most of his life, his confidence had been unshakable, a fortress built brick by brick out of victories and dismissals, deals struck and rivals crushed. But now the fortress trembled. He could feel it in the weight of the silence pressing against him, in the stares of the crowd gathered along the marble walls. Dozens of eyes fixed on him, assistants who had fetched his coffee, interns who had rushed to carry his papers, receptionists who had whispered his name with equal parts awe and fear. And now every one of them was waiting to see what he would do. His pride rose up like fire in his throat. He told himself that to bow even slightly would unravel everything he had built. A lifetime of being untouchable did not end in a lobby, not at the words of a janitor. Yet the longer he stood there, the more the weight of his own silence betrayed him. The crowd wasn't moving. Phones were raised high, lenses gleaming. Every second stretched, branding him with the image of a man too proud to face the truth spoken by a little girl with a sketchbook. Jack stepped closer, his presence steady, his voice low enough to strike without theatrics. "One day your daughter will look at you the way mine looks at me," he said. "Ask yourself what you want her to see." Mercer's chest constricted. That sentence cut deeper than any insult ever hurled his way, because it found the one place his pride had never reached, his daughter. She was 13 now, tucked away in a world of private schools and gated estates, a child he barely saw between flights and meetings. But he remembered her when she was Sarah's age, when she still reached for his hand in public, when she drew crayon hearts on sticky notes and plastered them to his office door. Somewhere along the way, he had stopped looking at her, stopped seeing her. Now Jack's words dragged her face into his mind like a mirror he couldn't turn away from. If she saw him here, sneering at a child, too proud to acknowledge cruelty, what would remain of him in her eyes? Would she laugh nervously? No, the way his colleagues did? Or worse, would she look at him with the same trembling disappointment Sarah had shown moments ago? Mercer blinked, and for the first time that night, his jaw trembled. He fought it, locking his muscles, clenching his teeth, trying to hold together the mask that had carried him through decades. But the edges of it cracked. Pride and conscience battled inside him, one screaming for control, the other whispering with a voice he hadn't listened to in years. The whisper won. His arms fell slowly to his sides. His gaze dropped from Jack's steady eyes to Sarah's wide, tear-brimmed ones. And before he could stop himself, the words forced their way out, fractured and rough, like stone splitting under pressure. "I'm sorry." The sound wasn't polished, not rehearsed, not crafted for headlines or markets. It was raw, jagged, reluctant, but real. It was enough to silence even the echoes bouncing off marble and glass. The crowd stilled completely. No murmurs now, no shifting feet. Just the shock of watching Mercer Crane, a man who had built his empire on refusing to bend, lower his head before a janitor's daughter. Sarah blinked, clutching her sketchbook tighter, unsure if she believed him, but recognizing the weight of the moment. Jack gave the smallest nod, not gloating, not triumphant, simply acknowledging the truth that had finally broken through. For Mercer, the apology landed like both a collapse and a release. His pride had cracked, yes, but in that breaking, he felt something unfamiliar, something he hadn't carried in years. Humanity. It was fragile, heavy, terrifying, and it was enough. The three executives, men who had built empires out of control and arrogance, now stood with their heads lowered. It wasn't a staged gesture or some rehearsed display for the press. It was the quiet, undeniable weight of shame bending them forward. For a moment, the scene didn't feel real. The marble lobby, usually filled with polished conversations and the echo of heels on stone, had been transformed into something else entirely, a place where power cracked open and revealed its hollow center. And at the heart of it all was a girl no taller than their waist, holding a sketchbook pressed against her chest. Dozens of phones caught the image, the lenses glowing like watchful eyes. It would live far beyond this building, carried into feeds and headlines, but those recordings couldn't capture the silence in the room, the air vibrating with something raw and human. The bowed heads of the CEOs weren't just a concession. They were a fracture in the hierarchy everyone had accepted as unshakable. For assistants who had been spoken over, for interns who had been made invisible, for receptionists whose greetings had gone unanswered, the sight was more than symbolic. It was vindication. Jack didn't smile. His face remained steady, carved with something deeper than satisfaction. This wasn't a victory to gloat over. It was a truth finally recognized, a truth that shouldn't have needed a confrontation in the first place. He turned from the bowed figures and lowered himself back to Sarah's side. His knee touched the marble, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. She looked up at him, her lashes wet, her lip trembling. "See?" he whispered, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You don't have to be loud to be heard." Her eyes flooded, and she leaned into him, pressing her forehead against his shoulder. The sketchbook shifted in her arms as her tears finally fell, not of defeat, but of release. For the first time since the juice box had spilled, she let herself breathe. She had watched her father stand tall, she had watched giants bend, and now she let the weight she carried slip out in quiet sobs against the fabric of his uniform. Jack wrapped his arm around her, steady, protective, not shielding her from the world, but reminding her she wasn't facing it alone. Around them, the silence began to break. It started as a single clap from the far side of the lobby, tentative, uncertain, like someone testing whether it was allowed. Then another joined, stronger, followed by a third. Soon the applause spread across the gathered crowd, swelling not with politeness or obligation, but with something honest. Assistants clapped with hands trembling. Receptionists clapped with tears on their cheeks. Interns clapped with the wild energy of people realizing they had just witnessed a moment no textbook could teach them. This wasn't the hollow applause of a gala. It wasn't the forced rhythm of a corporate event. It was messy, uneven, real. Human recognition in its purest form. The sound rose and filled the lobby, bouncing off glass and steel, chasing away the echoes of laughter that had started it all. The CEOs didn't lift their heads at first. Maybe they couldn't. Maybe they didn't dare. They stood there as the clapping washed over them, no longer the tallest figures in the room, but the smallest. The applause wasn't for them, and they knew it. It was for the janitor who had spoken with dignity, for the child who had shown them their reflection, for the crowd who had found their own voices in the act of witnessing. Sarah pulled back slightly, her tears still streaking her cheeks, but a small, trembling smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. She looked at her father with a mix of awe and relief, as if she had finally seen what she had always hoped, that strength wasn't about power, but about presence. Jack brushed a strand of hair from her face and gave her the faintest nod, steady and certain. The clapping grew louder, echoing like thunder across the marble. And in the center of it all, a janitor and his daughter stood together, their silence having spoken louder than any speech the tower had ever heard. By morning, the story had already outrun the building. It left the marble lobby and spilled into headlines, into whispers at coffee shops, into the glow of phone screens across the city. The merger, once billed as the event of the quarter, was an afterthought. Nobody cared about the numbers anymore. They cared about the sight of three powerful CEOs lowering their heads before a little girl clutching a sketchbook. The image burned itself into feeds and timelines, replayed over and over, until even those who had never set foot in Harrington Tower could recite the details. Jack saw it all only in glimpses. His co-workers shoved phones under his nose, links to articles, shaky videos taken from the crowd. "That's you, man. That's you and your daughter," they'd say, half grinning, half stunned. Jack would glance, nod once, and return to his work. He didn't answer the reporters who left messages on his voicemail. He didn't step in front of cameras or prepare statements. He just kept showing up, mop in hand, same as always. The difference wasn't in him. It was in the eyes that followed him. Where once people brushed past him without a glance, they now paused. Assistants who used to avert their gaze greeted him softly, with a kind of reverence, as though they weren't sure how to address him anymore. Interns whispered when he walked by, not mockery, but awe. Even the executives, men and women who had built their reputations on being untouchable, shifted in their steps when he entered a room. Some nodded. Some murmured hellos they had never bothered with before. Jack accepted it all with the same quiet dignity he had carried long before the world noticed. He didn't gloat. He didn't let their sudden recognition swell into pride. Pride wasn't the point. He was the same man he had been before the spill of a juice box set the night ablaze. The same man who polished brass door handles until they gleamed, who pushed carts through echoing hallways, who made sure the floor was safe for shoes far more expensive than his own. The only difference now was that people finally saw him. Sarah saw the change, too. She noticed how strangers smiled at her when she clutched her sketchbook in the lobby, how employees stopped to ask what she was drawing. She noticed how the security guard, once stiff and distant, now bent down to greet her with a wink. And she noticed, most of all, how her father walked a little taller, not because he wanted to, but because the world had finally stopped trying to push him down. At home, things were quieter. Jack still woke early, still made her breakfast, still checked her homework before sending her off to school. But there was a new kind of silence between them, not heavy, not burdened. A silence that said everything without words, that what had happened mattered, that it had shifted something neither of them could name. When Sarah asked if he was proud, Jack only shook his head softly. "Not proud," he said. "Relieved. Because now maybe you'll grow up knowing the world listens, even if it takes too long." She didn't fully understand, not yet, but she hugged him tighter, and that was enough. The world moved on quickly, as it always does. Other scandals rose, other headlines stole attention. But inside Harrington Tower, the echo of that night lingered. The staff still spoke about it in hushed tones. The video still resurfaced on feeds, shared as proof that truth could still topple arrogance, and Jack kept mopping the floors, polishing the chrome, emptying the bins, dignity in his heart, cloth in his hand, not because he had changed, but because the world had finally remembered to see him. That night, the apartment was quiet except for the scratch of pencil against paper. The city hummed faintly outside their windows, horns and sirens drifting up like a distant reminder that life hadn't paused for what had happened in the lobby. But for Sarah, time had slowed into something soft and steady. She sat at the kitchen table with her sketchbook open, head bent, tongue peeking from the corner of her mouth, the way it always did when she was concentrating. The lamp above her cast a golden circle across the page, leaving the rest of the small kitchen in shadow. Jack leaned against the counter, arms folded, watching her work. There was something calming about it, the way she poured herself into the lines. Her pencil moved quickly, not with the frantic strokes of fear he had seen earlier in the day, but with something deliberate, confident. Each line carried a certainty that hadn't been there before. When she finally lifted the sketchbook and turned it toward him, Jack felt his throat tighten. Gone were the towering, faceless giants she had drawn before. Gone was the small, bowed figure that had broken his heart. This time, she had drawn him. He stood tall in her picture, shoulders square, his hand resting lightly on her small one. Beside them, she had sketched herself, not small or diminished, but steady and upright, her sketchbook clutched close like a shield. In front of them were three figures in suits, bent forward, their heads lowered. Their faces were little more than outlines, but the message was unmistakable, and above it all, written in bold block letters that took up half the page, was a single word: respect. Jack stared at it for a long moment. His chest swelled with something too large for words, pride and sorrow and hope all tangled together. He pulled out the chair beside her and sat down, the kitchen light reflecting off the weary lines of his face. He reached over, brushing his calloused thumb along the top edge of the page. Respect, he murmured, as if testing the weight of it. Sarah's eyes lifted to his, wide and shining. "That's what you looked like today," she said. "Not just to me, to everyone." Jack swallowed hard. He wanted to tell her that he hadn't felt tall, that he'd felt terrified and raw, that the words had come from memory more than courage. But looking at her, he realized it didn't matter. What she saw was what counted. He leaned in, pressing a kiss gently to her forehead, lingering there as if the gesture itself could anchor her to this moment. "Never let anyone take your voice," he whispered. Her lips curled into a small smile. "I won't," she said softly. She hugged the sketchbook against her chest like a promise. Then she looked at him with a seriousness far beyond her years. "Because you gave it back to me." Jack closed his eyes for a second, steadying himself against the force of her words. He had spent so long carrying silence like armor, letting the world walk past him, that he had almost forgotten what it meant to be heard. But tonight, sitting in their small kitchen, with his daughter's drawing glowing under the lamplight, he understood something he hadn't before. It wasn't his apology or his defiance that mattered most. It was what it gave her, the chance to see that dignity could stand taller than cruelty, that even a child's voice could shift the weight of giants. Sarah turned back to her page, adding the final strokes with careful precision. Jack sat quietly beside her, listening to the sound of her pencil as though it were music, as though every scratch against the paper was building a future she could believe in. And for the first time in a long time, he believed in it too. In the days that followed, the building returned to its usual rhythm of polished shoes on marble, clipped conversations echoing in hallways, and elevators rising and falling with precision. But in three separate offices, perched high above the city, silence pressed heavier than usual. The three CEOs who had once laughed at a child now found themselves haunted by the image of her wide eyes and trembling sketchbook. They had bowed, however briefly, and though the world had already begun to move on to the next headline, none of them could. Evelyn Roth sat at her desk, the city sprawling in neat grids beyond the glass wall. She had delivered countless speeches about innovation, about leadership, about progress, but the memory of Sarah's drawing clung to her more stubbornly than any of her accolades. Giants that forget people have hearts. The words played again and again, cutting deeper each time. She remembered her own mother scrubbing diner counters late into the night, how she had pretended not to notice the exhaustion etched into her face. Evelyn had sworn she would climb high enough that no one could make her mother feel small again. But somewhere along the climb, she had forgotten who she was climbing for. That week, she signed a check to fund new community schools, not for publicity, not for headlines, but because she needed to remind herself that her power meant nothing if it didn't touch the ground it stood on. Thomas Vale's reflection came in quieter waves. He had always been pragmatic, the kind of man who measured worth in charts and outcomes, not in sentiment. But Sarah's tears had pierced something he thought long buried. He couldn't stop remembering his own hand-me-down shoes, the sting of laughter on the playground, the way he had promised himself that strength meant never looking back. Now he saw how wrong he had been. One afternoon he drove across town to a youth center unannounced and offered to mentor teenagers who reminded him of the boy he once was. He sat with them, awkward at first, then more comfortably, telling stories about the mistakes he had made and the truths he wished someone had told him. They didn't know him as a CEO. They knew him only as a man who had once been small and still remembered what it felt like. Mercer Crane, though, his reckoning was the hardest. Pride had been his companion for so long it had become indistinguishable from his skin. He tried to push the memory away, to drown it beneath meetings, phone calls, and contracts. But at night, when the city dimmed and the offices emptied, Jack's words echoed back to him. One day your daughter will look at you the way mine looks at me. Ask yourself what you want her to see. The thought gnawed at him until he could no longer ignore it. One evening he found himself in front of a florist, staring at bouquets he didn't know how to choose. He walked out with simple lilies and drove to the home of his estranged daughter, a girl he hadn't seen in over a year. He stood at her doorstep longer than he had the courage to knock, but when she finally opened the door, her eyes widened in shock. He said nothing eloquent, nothing rehearsed, just, "I'm sorry." It wasn't enough, not yet, but it was a start. Jack Renner knew none of this. He didn't need to. He continued pushing his cart through the hallways, wiping down fingerprints from brass handles, emptying trash bins with the same quiet dedication as before. The world had shifted around him, but he had no illusions about his role in it. He wasn't a hero, not to himself. He was a father who had spoken up when silence would have broken his daughter. That was enough. Still, the echo of that night followed the three CEOs home. It trailed them into offices, lingered in their reflections on glass windows, settled into the quiet moments when pride loosened its grip. Giants had been reminded they had hearts, and though they would never admit it aloud, a janitor's words had done what no boardroom ever could. They had made them human again. Months later, the marble lobby gleamed, as it always did, the same polished floor that had seen more footsteps than stories. Jack Renner moved through it with his broom in hand, his motions steady and practiced, the rhythm of a man who had made peace with routine. To anyone passing by, it was just another ordinary morning. But to Jack, the silence carried something different now. It no longer felt like invisibility. It felt like space, room for memory, room for possibility. He was sweeping near the reception desk when he noticed a young woman hovering nearby. An intern, judging by the way her ID badge swung awkwardly on its lanyard and the way she kept shifting her weight from one foot to the other, as though unsure if she had the right to interrupt. Jack looked up, offering the faint, quiet smile he gave to anyone who paused long enough to see him. "Mr. Renner?" she asked softly, her voice carrying both nerves and respect. Jack straightened, leaning lightly on the broom handle. "That's me," he said, his tone calm, unassuming. She glanced down, gathered her courage, then met his eyes. I saw what you did that day, in the lobby, with your daughter." She swallowed, words trembling as they escaped. "I just wanted to say, thank you. You made me believe I could speak up too." Jack blinked, his chest tightening. He hadn't thought much about that night in a while, not because it had lost its meaning, but because life had demanded its steady rhythms again. Bills to pay, floors to clean, homework to check. Yet here was a reminder that moments don't vanish when the noise fades. They linger, carried quietly in the hearts of those who needed them most. He smiled gently, shaking his head. "Don't thank me," he said, his voice low but certain. "Thank my daughter. She's the reason I spoke." From across the lobby, Sarah looked up from her sketchbook. She had been sprawled in one of the chairs, doodling as she waited for him to finish his shift. She caught the tail end of the conversation, her eyes widening when she realized her father had placed the credit squarely in her hands. Her cheeks flushed, and for the first time in that towering building, she didn't feel small. She felt seen. The intern gave a shy smile, nodded, and hurried off to the elevators, but the echo of her words stayed behind. Jack leaned back on his broom for a moment, watching Sarah's grin stretch wide as she hugged her sketchbook closer. She didn't know it yet, but this this look on her face, was the legacy he wanted to leave. Not headlines, not stories shared in hushed tones, not even the image of 3 bowed heads. It was this, his daughter standing taller in her own skin, her voice carrying weight because she believed it did. Jack crossed the lobby and ruffled her hair lightly. "What's that smile for?" he teased. Sarah giggled, ducking her head. "Nothing," she said, though the sparkle in her eyes gave her away. Jack sat beside her for a moment, broom resting against the chair, the hum of the lobby carrying around them. He thought about Emma, about the night she whispered, "They don't see me," and about how different this moment was. Sarah was smiling. Sarah was seen. And in her joy, Emma's dream lived on, reshaped into something stronger than steel and glass. Jack knew the world would forget again. That's what the world does. Headlines fade, applause dies down, and people return to their routines. But he also knew that somewhere out there, interns would speak up in meetings, assistants would lift their heads a little higher, and children would carry sketchbooks filled with truth. And if Sarah grew up believing her voice mattered, that was enough. That was everything. The lobby bustled again, executives striding past, phones pressed to their ears, but Jack no longer felt invisible. He didn't need their nods or their praise. He had already left his mark, not in the building's foundation, but in his daughter's. And in the quiet grin she gave him that morning, he saw the final lesson made real. He hadn't just given her back her voice. He had taught her never to let it go. If this story moved you, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments below. What part of Jack and Sarah's journey spoke to you most? And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next story that might just remind you how powerful kindness and courage can be.